Picture the biggest reservoir in America the way it looked at the turn of the millennium, then picture it today. The difference isn't subtle, it's the kind of drop that turns boat ramps into driveways leading nowhere. Tonight we're looking at what may be the most ambitious water security project of the last 20 years. An effort to reach a lake's water not by praying for rain, but by tunneling half a mile beneath the lakebed itself and pulling the plug on the nation's largest bathtub from below. Right now, hundreds of feet under the surface of southern Nevada's giant reservoir, $1.5 billion piece of engineering is quietly siphoning water out of the dark. It was built for one reason: to keep a desert metropolis running long after the lake drops past the point where Hoover Dam itself goes dry. Old photographs, pulled from a university archive, show the same reservoir spilling over its banks back in August of 1983, gorged on a historic flood. That was the last time it was truly full. Since the late 90s, the surface has fallen roughly 130 feet. What that means in practice: the waterline used to sit far above where the current shoreline now ends, at the very top of a pale mineral stain that locals have taken to calling the bathtub ring. 20 years ago, Las Vegas made a bet. City planners gambled that the reservoir feeding their taps would keep shrinking rather than recover, and they built accordingly. What they built is now racing against a threshold near the very floor of the lake, a line nobody upstream wants to see crossed. There's a band of bleached rock circling the reservoir's walls, baked in by decades of sun. From the water, it looks like a tub that hasn't been cleaned in years. From the air, it reads like a scar across the desert. This lake is the water supply for all of southern Nevada, and standing on the shore looking up at that ring feels less like sightseeing and more like reading a warning label. This reservoir hasn't been full since 1983. Experts who track it say refilling it now would take back-to-back years of exceptional mountain snowfall, a run of winters wetter than anything the region has seen recently. Since 2000 alone, the water level has fallen by around 160 feet. A lake once holding 26 million acre-feet, enough to submerge the entire state of Pennsylvania under a foot of water, now holds roughly 8 million. Call it 30% of its design capacity. That's not a trivia number. Something like 25 million people rely on this single body of water. Las Vegas pulls 9 in every 10 gallons that come out of its taps from this lake. Farmland across Arizona and California draws from the same source, as does a wide stretch of northern Mexico. And the dam that created the reservoir in the first place spins its power turbines using that same shrinking supply. Back in 1922, 7 states signed an interstate compact dividing up the river's water. As the lake has fallen, so has the electricity that depends on it. Hoover Dam's output has dropped by roughly a third since the reservoir was last considered healthy, and it keeps sliding. At the very bottom sits a threshold with a name that sounds pulled from a disaster movie: Deadpool. At 895 feet above sea level, the water sits too low to move through the dam's structure at all. No downstream flow, no hydropower, nothing on the other side. For the cities and farms built around whatever comes out the far side of that dam, Deadpool isn't a technical term. It's existential. Las Vegas saw this coming 2 decades ago. The city sank $1.5 billion into a machine buried at the reservoir's floor, built to reach water below the level where everyone else's supply runs dry. It's operating today, while the lake sits at depths not recorded since the 1930s. But to understand why that machine exists, you need to see how the river fell far enough to need it, and that starts with what got built here to begin with. In 1931, 1 in 4 Americans was without work. Banks were collapsing, and Washington needed a project enormous enough to put real numbers of people back to work. What got greenlit in the Nevada desert struck many engineers of the era as borderline impossible. The Colorado River had spent generations flooding and starving communities across the Southwest in equal measure, raging in spring, nearly a trickle by late summer. The Bureau of Reclamation had scouted a canyon site on the Nevada-Arizona line since the early 1920s. What emerged from that scouting became Hoover Dam, a structure with no real precedent in American engineering. Construction ran from 1931 onward. At its peak, more than 5,000 workers labored in canyon heat that regularly topped 120 degrees, housed in a town built from scratch, Boulder City, purely to shelter the workforce. Over 5 years, crews poured 3.25 million cubic yards of concrete, enough to pave a 2-lane highway coast to coast. When it was finished in 1936, it stood as the largest poured concrete structure humans had ever built, 726 feet tall, more than 1,200 feet across the crest. Behind it formed a reservoir stretching over 100 miles into the desert, the same lake we're talking about tonight. Full, it holds just over 26 million acre-feet or nearly 9 trillion gallons, enough to supply every household in the country for well over a decade. Before the dam, the river was something to survive. After it, the river became the water supply for Phoenix, Tucson, Las Vegas, Los Angeles, San Diego, cities that couldn't have grown to their current size without water and electricity flowing out of this one structure. At full pool, the dam's turbines generate around 4 billion kilowatt-hours a year, split roughly 55% to California, a quarter to Nevada, and the rest to Arizona, over lines stretching hundreds of miles. It was more than infrastructure. Built by men earning around 50 cents an hour, in conditions that killed roughly 100 of them, the dam became a symbol of what the country could still accomplish while everything else was falling apart. Franklin Roosevelt called it a wonder of the age. Close to 1 million visitors a year still walk out onto its crest. For the towns downstream, though, it was never a tourist attraction. It's the reason they exist at all. When the dam was finished in 1936, Las Vegas had roughly 8,000 residents. Today the metro area holds more than 2 million people, and 9 of every 10 gallons coming out of its taps trace back to this lake. Take the lake away and the city stops functioning. The same dependency stretches across the region. The Colorado system supplies somewhere near 40 million people across 7 states, numerous tribal nations, and a slice of Mexico. For decades the system worked exactly as designed. The lake filled, the turbines turned, and the Southwest grew up around a quiet assumption that the supply was essentially limitless. That assumption is where the trouble was hiding, because the river everyone built around was never quite the river that actually existed. In November of 1922, delegates from 7 states met in Santa Fe and signed the Colorado River Compact, splitting the river's flow between an upper basin, Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, New Mexico, and a lower basin, Arizona, Nevada, California. Each side got 7.5 million acre-feet a year. A later treaty handed Mexico another 1.5 million. All told, the paperwork promised 16.5 million acre-feet annually forever. There was a problem buried in the math. Negotiators built their split on river flow records from 1906 through 1929, one of the wettest stretches in the river's known history. They mistook an unusually generous run of years for the normal baseline. Longer-term data, pulled from centuries of tree rings and climate records, puts the river's actual average flow closer to 13.5 million acre-feet a year. The states had divided up water that the river, on average, was never actually delivering, and in recent decades it's delivered even less than that long-term average. Since 2000, annual flow has averaged closer to 12 million acre-feet, against legal claims of 16.5 million. Roughly a quarter of the promised water simply isn't there. It never was, it was a figure on a page. That shortfall has to be covered somehow, and for 20 years it's been covered by draining the lake's own stored reserves. The decline crept in slowly, around 1,200 feet above sea level in 2000, below 1,150 by 2004, below 1,100 by 2010. By 2016 it had slipped under 1,080, triggering the first formal federal shortage warnings. By 2021 it crossed below 1,075, the line at which regulators declare a Tier 1 shortage and impose mandatory cuts on Arizona, Nevada, and Mexico. Arizona, holding the most junior water rights, absorbed the deepest cuts, with farms that had irrigated from this river for generations told flatly their allocation was shrinking. Then in 2022 the lake bottomed out at 1,041 feet, its lowest level since it was first filled. Boat ramps that had run for decades sat stranded on cracked dry ground. Marinas closed outright. As the water pulled back, it surrendered things that had been hidden for half a century: a sunken World War II-era landing craft, abandoned houseboats, and, unsettlingly, human remains sealed inside a barrel. Scientists who study tree ring records call this the driest extended stretch the region has experienced in at least 12 centuries, a mega-drought, not a bad season that resolves itself. Rising temperatures compound it, evaporating more water off the surface, drying soil faster, and shrinking the mountain snowpack that feeds the river each spring. This century's flows have run roughly 30% below the levels recorded when the 1922 numbers were calculated. Negotiators in Santa Fe likely knew their figures were generous, but a deal got signed anyway. The alternative was 7 states failing to agree at all, which would have killed the dam project outright. For decades that trade-off was worth it. Now the accounting deferred back then is finally coming due. The reservoir is managed through a tiered shortage system, and each line crossed brings deeper cuts. At 1,075 feet, regulators declare Tier 1, Arizona loses 512,000 acre-feet, an 18% cut. Nevada loses 21,000, Mexico loses 41,000. The lake has sat below that mark since 2020 and keeps edging toward the next threshold. At 1,050 feet, cuts deepen further. At 1,035 feet, Tier 3, the story turns to electricity. Below that line, 12 of Hoover Dam's 17 turbines can no longer function. Generating capacity collapses from over 1,300 megawatts to roughly 382, nearly a 70% loss, felt across every household on the grid. Below 1,000 feet, the entire river system moves into territory of genuine systemic failure. But those tiers only reshuffle scarcity between states, farms, and cities. They don't produce a single additional drop. Below them sit two thresholds of an entirely different order. At 950 feet, the reservoir reaches minimum power pool, the surface drops below the dam's turbine intakes entirely, and the roughly 4 billion kilowatt-hours generated each year simply stops. And at 895 feet comes dead pool. Water too low to pass through the dam's outlet works by gravity at all. Nothing moves downstream. For the tens of millions of people whose water systems were built on the assumption that this river never stops flowing, dead pool is the end of the road. The lake currently sits around 160 feet above that line. That might sound like breathing room until you remember that in 2000 it sat 330 feet above it, meaning it's covered half that remaining distance in just 25 years, with no sign of the trend reversing. Reduced flows, hotter temperatures, and a legal framework promising more water than the river carries, none of that has been resolved. There's one more wrinkle. Hoover Dam's intake towers were engineered in the 1930s to draw from fixed depths. As the lake has fallen, those intakes have become progressively less useful. In 2022, the uppermost intake on the Nevada side briefly sat exposed above the waterline entirely. The dam is boxed in by where its pipes were physically built, whatever the shortage tiers say on paper. Talks among the 7 basin states had dragged on in various forms for over a decade. In 2026, time nearly caught up with them. The system runs top-down. Snow falls across the Rockies each winter, melts in spring, fills the upper reservoir behind Glen Canyon Dam in northern Arizona, and gets released downstream into the lake we've been discussing. Snow, melt, flow, fill, that cycle keeps both reservoirs alive. Over the winter of 2025 into 2026, the Rocky Mountain snowpack came in at record lows. A heat wave arrived in March before the snow had properly melted, evaporating much of what runoff remained. The upstream reservoir dropped faster than projections had anticipated, and the system revealed a brutal internal logic. The upstream dam only generates power once its own water sits above a minimum line. Federal water managers faced an unwelcome choice: protect the upstream dam's power generation, or keep releasing water downstream to prop up the lake we've been following. In April 2026, officials chose to protect the upstream reservoir. Releases downstream were cut by roughly 1.48 million acre-feet for the year, with regulators acknowledging the decision could speed the downstream lake's decline, including up to a 40% reduction in Hoover Dam's hydropower output as early as that autumn. Stacked on a third already lost over the prior 2 decades, a further 40% cut would leave the dam producing something like a quarter of its healthy lake output. Then in May 2026, a federal 24-month projection suggested the lake could fall to 1,021 feet by the summer of 2027, shattering the 2022 record low by more than 20 feet. The people feeling it first are Arizona's farmers. Picture a 4th-generation grower standing at the edge of a field that's produced cotton, alfalfa, and winter vegetables for 100 years, now told there's no water left to give it. The 336-mile canal system that carries river water to Phoenix and Tucson has delivered shrinking allocations for years, and some growers have lost surface water entirely. The towns built around those farms are shrinking with them. California, meanwhile, has faced no mandatory cuts at all. Its 4.4 million acre-foot allocation is protected by seniority until the lake crosses a threshold it hasn't reached yet. When it does, the legal fight over California's share will dwarf every water dispute the American West has seen. The 7 states were supposed to finalize a new long-term management framework by February 2026, replacing interim rules expiring at year's end. They missed that deadline. In May, 3 of the lower basin states proposed leaving more water in the system through 2028. The upper basin states didn't sign on, and no concrete agreement has emerged since. Every short-term patch negotiated over the past 20 years has done the same thing: bought time without closing the gap between what the river actually delivers and what a 100-year-old document promises. The lake has fallen through every one of those patches, and the margin for another is thinner than it's ever been. Which is exactly the outcome one city refused to leave to chance. When people picture what's draining this lake, the desert city on its shore comes to mind first: the fountains, the hotel towers, the golf courses carved improbably into the Mojave. Surely that city is a huge part of the problem. The numbers say otherwise. Southern Nevada's entire annual allocation from the river is just 300,000 acre-feet. Arizona receives 8 times that. California receives 13 times more. Agriculture across the Southwest consumes roughly 70% of all Colorado River water. The desert city accounts for a sliver of what a single farming region uses in a year, and despite its reputation for excess, it runs one of the most water-efficient large urban systems in North America. For 2 decades, while state negotiations stalled, it kept spending to stay that way. That effort broke into 4 pieces. Conservation started with grass. Decorative lawns nobody walked on soaked up irrigation water that could never be recovered, and existed purely for appearance. So the region began paying residents to rip them out, a few dollars for every square foot of ornamental turf removed and replaced with desert landscaping. Since the late 1990s, roughly 250 million square feet have been torn up, saving something in the neighborhood of 200 billion gallons. The work's nearly done. By 2027, all non-functional grass will be barred from using river water entirely. Between 2002 and 2024, the metro area cut per capita water use by more than half while adding over 800,000 new residents. The population grew by nearly 1 million people and the city still used less total water than before they arrived. Recycling is the second piece. Nearly all water used indoors gets treated and returned to the lake, earning the city credit for every gallon sent back. Gross withdrawals run close to 600,000 acre-feet a year, but net consumption stays right at the 300,000 acre-foot cap. Roughly half of everything drawn comes straight back. The tunnel is where the real money went, and it's the centerpiece of this whole story. The original 2 intake pipes were engineered when the reservoir was reliably full, built for a lake nobody expected to fall this far. As levels dropped through the 2000s, engineers reached an alarming conclusion. Eventually those intakes would sit exposed above the waterline, sucking air while the lake kept retreating. So in 2005, the Water Authority approved a 3rd intake, budgeted at $812 million, with construction beginning in 2008. Picture the crew boring nearly 2 miles and hundreds of feet down, working inside a 24-foot wide tunnel beneath an active reservoir, nothing overhead but rock, and beyond that, millions of tons of water pressing through leaking fault lines. The machine ground through hard rock for an hour, then saturated waterlogged ground the next, with no daylight and no quick way out. The finished tunnel ran nearly 3 miles, feeding an intake structure anchored to the reservoir floor with over 1,000 truckloads of concrete. Tunneling ran from 2011 to 2014. The completed intake structure weighs over 1,200 tons. Engineers who specialize in this kind of work considered it among the most technically demanding tunneling projects finished anywhere in the world that decade, and it collected engineering awards from organizations in the US, Switzerland, and Britain. The new intake went live in September 2015, reaching far deeper than the old pipes, though it still shared pumping equipment with them, which capped its usefulness above 1,000 feet. So the authority went further, building a dedicated low lake level pumping station, completed in 2020 and switched on in April 2022 at almost the exact moment falling water disabled one of the original pump stations. It came in under budget, near $520 million, capable of moving up to 900 million gallons a day. Combined, the new intake and pump station can reach water sitting at 875 feet above sea level. Compare that to Dead Pool at 895 feet. This system reaches water 20 feet below the point at which the dam itself stops releasing anything downstream. If the lake ever falls far enough that Arizona, California, and Mexico lose their supply entirely, this one city can still draw water from whatever remains. Total cost of the intake system: roughly $1.5 billion, arguably the most direct answer any city on this lake has given to the question of what happens when the water keeps falling. A 4th, quieter piece rounds it out: underground storage through artificial recharge. Treated water has been injected into local aquifers for years, a banked reserve, spread across projects in several states and inside the reservoir itself, now holding more than 2.2 million acre-feet. A hidden buffer for whenever the lake drops fastest or the cuts land hardest. The conservation gains are real. The recycling loop functions. The tunnel reaches below Dead Pool. And none of it makes the river carry a single additional gallon than it actually holds. Which leaves the harder question still open. What happens once the lake falls past the point where even the best preparation can reach? Despite everything one city has built, the lake sits around 1/3 full, and the wider river system keeps grinding under the same three pressures: drought, a warming climate, and decades of promising more water than the river can supply. The engineering hasn't stopped either. In May 2026, federal regulators announced roughly $52 million in spending on new turbines for Hoover Dam itself. The old units lose most of their capacity once the lake drops below 1,035 feet, from 1,300 plus megawatts down to 382. The replacements are wide-head turbines designed to keep generating all the way down to 950 feet, the minimum power pool line, through conditions their original 1930s designers never planned for. Notice what these two projects share. The tunnel reaches below dead pool. The new turbines keep generating through conditions that would have shut the old ones down completely. Both are engineering responses to a falling lake. Neither is a response to why it keeps falling. They buy time. They don't buy water. Not every downstream community has a fix on this scale. Phoenix draws from a canal system already delivering reduced allocations year after year. When California's protected threshold finally gets crossed, the resulting fight will likely be the most consequential water dispute the American West has ever seen. And Mexico, entitled to 1.5 million acre-feet a year under a 1944 treaty, has no backup plan at all. At dead pool, that delivery simply stops, with no alternative source for the farms that feed millions of people on both sides of the border. The bathtub ring marks 160 feet of water that used to be there and now simply isn't. At an average decline of 6 to 7 feet a year over the past 2 decades, the distance remaining to dead pool is measured in decades, possibly fewer, depending entirely on what the Rockies produce in winters to come, and on whether 7 states can finally agree to use less water than a 100-year-old document says they're owed. In the end, this lake is only a symptom. The stain on the rock is just the most visible marker of a much larger reckoning still unfolding: whether the American Southwest can adapt to a river that may never again deliver what it delivered across the 20th century. That story is still being written. If you had to choose, would you protect the farms that feed the country, the cities that grew up trusting the water would always be there, or the river itself before there's nothing left to divide?